The following is a presentation of the Matt Talk Podcast Network.
International Podcast Day is September 30th, and you can help spread the word. International Podcast Day is dedicated to promoting podcasting worldwide. You may be asking, what can I do to get involved? It's pretty simple. First, head over to internationalpodcastday.com and check the suggestions. Second, use hashtag Podcast Day to join in the conversation. Remember September 30th. Now, let's start the conversation.
It's time to go on the mat, a presentation of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame Dan Gable Museum. It's brought to you by Rolling Ford in Shell Rock.
Welcome to On the Mat. I am Kyle Klingman of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame Dan Gable Museum, joined by the original Spin Master himself, Doug Van Gelder. Welcome.
Spin Master, I like that.
Yeah,
I can put a positive spin on anything.
Or a unique spin. Sometimes I think your spin is quite interesting, and that's why I think it's good to have your take on this show.
Okay,
Appreciate that, Kyle. You come up with different angles and perspectives, and a lot of times they're in my way of thinking, and a lot of times they're way out there, but that's why you need these things to keep us balanced, and it's all about opening the conversation, not closing it. Wouldn't you say? We're not trying to...
Continuing it.
Yeah, continuing it and coming up with new ideas, and I think probably one of our, I don't want to say disagreements, I'm not as sold on getting rid of writing time. I know it's something you've been passionate about for years.
I obsess about it.
You obsess about it. And the tirade you had about junior highs not having team scoring and not having weight classes, that was pretty iconic for our show. You got pretty riled up on that.
I do get riled up on that. That was just, I don't want to go there again.
Well, but it's funny to talk about because I can just see if you're saying you don't want to go there again, we could spend this whole segment seeing you spin out of control.
Yeah.
And that might be a fun segment.
We got
for those
somebody more important to hear from today.
Who?
Mr. Gibbons.
That's right. Joe Gibbons is going to be our guest today. And we're going to do a series of these before the wrestling season starts. We're going to dig in deep with a lot of these historical figures in our sport, Joe Gibbons being one of them. It's special to be able to say you're one of the 25 four-time state wrestling champions in Iowa. Even more special to say
was he
that
the,
and
was
went
he
on
the
and went
fourth
to an
one?
NCAA and he also went on to be an NCAA champion.
Was he the fourth one?
Correct. He was the fourth one. So he was in the early years of doing that. So it's going to be fun to talk to him. Parlay that into being a four-time All-American at Iowa State, top four finisher every year. So has a lot of things to talk about. So we get two segments with Joe Gibbons today. And we had him on a couple years ago when we talked more about his Family Legacy Award and talking about that. But we get to dive in with Joe Gibbons today. So make sure you stick around with that. After our last show, the news broke that Jay Robinson had been released as the head wrestling coach at the University of Minnesota. So to put it in perspective on who Jay Robinson is, for those who don't know, an important figure for our sport has now been let go from the University of Minnesota. And we'll talk about why and what went into that. But historically, I think it's really important to just say how important Jay Robinson has been to our sport. When he took over at the University of Minnesota in 1986, the program was not good. I think that Marty Morgan, who was an NCAA champion for Minnesota, said that there were maybe 200 people in the stands, and that was mainly family and friends, and that went up to, in 2002, when we went to the meet, they set the all-time attendance record. Yep. University of Minnesota versus Iowa at the Target Center.
Got to talk with Jesse Ventura that night.
He was at that
cool.
meet, and I think they did a great job of elevating the sport and taking it to an entirely new level. And it was a new game in town, similar to Ohio State now, where they won an NCAA championship a couple years ago. Minnesota was that team that didn't have the tradition and built the tradition when Jay Robinson came on board. And you can talk about the records, 3 NCAA championships. They won in 01, 02, and then 07. 2001, history was made when they had 10 All-Americans. Not one reached the NCAA tournament finals, nor the team has had 10 All-Americans in the history of our sport, not even Gable's team. So Jay Robinson's impact on the sport, we could go on and on and on about
Former
it.
Army Ranger, correct?
Former Army Ranger.
I mean, that he built all his guys to be that tough.
Yeah, and there are times where it got critiqued and criticized. He parlayed that into his Jay Robinson camps.
Yep.
And I think that was his mentality, is that you break him down until you build yourself back up. I think it was a pretty simple philosophy. And it...
you either do or you're left in the dust.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
And I don't
That's where life is.
Well, but I don't think he deviated from that. And he was assistant coach with Gable for all those years. There was a little bit of a falling out, not necessarily with Gable, but with the University of Iowa, leaving because they wanted him to open up the books to his camps, and he said no. And he had that year period between the University of Iowa and Minnesota where he was still in Iowa City and then took the job in Minnesota. But according to Jay, I don't think he wanted to leave that job. I think he enjoyed it that much. They had a great dynamic. Gable and Robinson were on a run for those 7 years. They were there together and dominating the NCAA tournament scene. You could plausibly say that after Jay Robinson left, that's part of the reason that Iowa didn't go into a downfall but didn't win for a 4-year stretch. And then Gable came back and was able to win 6 out of 7 his last 7 years. But Jay Robinson was a big part of that championship culture that the University of Iowa had when they won 9 in a row. And all of that being said is that Jay Robinson's exit now, it leaves a sour taste in your mouth on how it had to end. Of course, anyone who followed it knows that it was a drug-related, where it was
Jay tried to save face for his program.
He did, and that's the way
what any coach
things.
is going to do.
Was it the right decision for the AD? I think when you look at the data, they're saying that Jay didn't handle it in the way that he should have, and they let him go.
Didn't handle it as openly as they wanted.
As openly, that's a good word. Yeah, openly as they would hope. Do you think it was the right thing?
He tried to keep it in-house. Who knows? Maybe other people have done that before. You don't know when they don't, when it doesn't come to light.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how that all came into place. I don't pretend to even know the all the things that went into that. So was it the right thing? I don't know. We talk about being more open, but I don't know. I like the idea that if you can solve your problems without letting the whole world know, you're better off.
I think that's probably where Jay stood on that.
Yeah.
And I think in reading all of this and even hearing Gable's comments, it is the window fell in the wrong spot for Jay, is that you had a new athletic director come in, and it was the perfect storm for this to happen, is that, hey, there's someone new in town. He gets to make a statement with Jay Robinson, who's successful, who, but by all accounts, and everyone knows this, Jay didn't sit quietly. Jay never sat quietly. He was always going to be that guy that said, hey, this is wrong, even if sometimes you said, hey, I don't necessarily agree with Jay on this. He was going to point things out, and he was going to say it as blunt as possible. And I think that
straightforward.
Yeah, it's very straightforward on that. And I think that rubbed people wrong. And so he had his own leanings, and he made them public. And I think that
I think a couple of the people that he barked at then cried. And I think that's when it all really fell apart.
Yeah. And I wish it didn't have to end this way, because they had a great documentary on Jay about his legacy in the sport and what he's done. But now, when you look back at it, I hope people see all of the positives that we listed off throughout his career. Being an Army Ranger, making the 72 Munich Olympic team in Greco-Roman, all the success at the University of Iowa, because clearly he was a huge part of that, and then the success at the University of Minnesota. And because he won, I think that's why he was allowed those opportunities to say those things.
You look at the camps that he's run up there in Minnesota, and I don't know if this is true or not, but that's Minnesota has become a hotbed up there. They've always got 1 or 2 teams in the top 25 in the high school level. I'll bet you a lot of those kids had a lot of camp hours with Jay Robinson.
It's possible. I don't know the data, but I do know that Jay would consider his greatest legacy
let's
that
face
camp.
It used to be a hockey state.
Well, it still is a hockey state.
But
not even close to a wrestling
when
state.
those 2 seasons are right there together. Hockey and wrestling. And I think he opened the door for wrestling at the high school level to be a more accepted and widely liked sport up there in Minnesota.
No, there's no doubt. I don't think it overtook hockey by any means. I still think that really is the sport. I still think that even in the state of Iowa, in a moment of honesty, hey, wrestling's a big deal here. It's still not bigger than basketball or football in our state. Those are still the sports that you talk about. It's part of our culture because we know about wrestling. But I guarantee you that random basketball fan at a University of Northern Iowa basketball game, they know about wrestling. They know it's popular here, but they aren't necessarily following it the passion that we are. Same with football. Football is always going to be king in any sport or in any state. And so I think that we have to appreciate, like you said, hey, what other state can you pack a junior high meet? State of Iowa, we get that. Holmes versus Pete, you're going to see a full house for that particular meet. It's special, but we're still probably the third most popular sport in the state of Iowa. The reason that you would pack a state wrestling tournament for wrestling is because you have multiple teams competing at the same time.
Yeah,
basketball,
all different towns are
correct. So
basketball, there's eight teams or whatever, four. What is it, 4 teams or 8 teams go to the state tournament?
I think it's 8. But even beside that point is you have 2 teams competing on the court at the same time, whereas in wrestling you could have 50, 60 at the same time. So it's
8
not
mats, 6 mats.
8 mats, but then you're going to have multi-schools going on, and it's going to rotate through. So that feeds into why you're able to get a lot of the participation, which is fantastic. And I wish I remembered this conversation. But a couple months ago, someone was telling me about their state championship, and they said, it's a joke. They said, we probably get 1,000 people, and it's at a high school gym. I can't remember if it was New Hampshire or Vermont or one of these states. They said, yeah, we get dual meets that have more people than the state wrestling tournament. They said it's kind of like a run-of-the-mill. And then when you think ours, when you get 16,000 people.
Those friends that came from Pennsylvania that I had when the Pete and Holmes meet went on. They were just flabbergasted. It's like, this is crazy.
It is. It's flabbergasting, and it's a special part of our culture in the state of Iowa. Minnesota, it's not there yet. We can dive into that more at another time. There's a new coach that's coming to Sioux City, Iowa. He wanted to be in the state of Iowa. He came from Minnesota. He's the winningest coach in all of high school wrestling. And he wanted to come to Iowa because he wanted to get
even more so than Florida. What was that team in Florida?
Well, he has the most dual meet wins individually as a high school wrestling coach. He has the most. He's at Sioux City High School right now. So we'll talk about that more. But all that being said, your final thoughts on Jay Robinson leaving and exiting in this?
I was sad. It's something that you hope never. It has to go that way, but I mean, it happened. The facts are there, and it's done.
Yeah.
So it's hard.
Future Minnesota wrestling program. Brandon Eggum takes over in the interim role. Do we both feel that? I think he's in a good position right now.
I think they're going to have a patch here where they're not going to be real great. But you could sense something the last couple years up there in Minnesota. They weren't the same team they were for a while, and that, when it all started to come out, it's like, oh my God, that's what was going on.
Yeah, you go in cycles, and I think that's the brilliance of any great coach is that they have an ability to adapt to those cycles and not let it slip too far behind, because you can be relevant for a long time and you can fall out of relevance within an instant, and we just saw that because all of Jay's legacy, all of that built, and it's not the ending that I would have hoped for Jay. It's just too bad that it had to end that way for Jay Robinson and such a historic career. On a positive note, talking about the state of Iowa being the kings of the wrestling universe, could we get the World Cup to come to Carver Hawkeye Arena in 2018?
I think they can. I mean, we had pretty good attendance again for the trials there this year, so the chance to see the best teams in the world, I think the Iowa wrestling fans would flock to that.
I do too. I think even more than just Iowa wrestling fans. I think a lot of people would come
from the Midwest here. I mean, it's always been out west the last several years, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been out in California.
Yeah,
Los Angeles. So to have it in the epicenter of the wrestling universe, I think that would be very wise for them to explore that opportunity. And I would like to see that even go up another level, because I would say the World Cup, if you rank it, you would say the Olympics, World Championships, and then probably the World Cup from an international tournament. I would love to see the World Championships come to Iowa City, Iowa. I think that the hang-up would be that the UWW, the United World Wrestling, that culture probably wouldn't have the outlets that they like that would be in Vegas, and I think you can read between the lines on what that might be. But I think that Iowa City would be...
The rest of the world loved the party that was going on in Las Vegas.
Well, but does Iowa City have enough infrastructure to hold the World Championships? I hope the answer is yes, but do they have the hotels? Do they have the culture to be able to do that?
I think they do. And Cedar Rapids, Waterloo. Everything. It's gonna if you have it in L.A., it's going to take you an hour to get there anyway. So you look at an hour radius around Iowa City, and you can find a lot of places for a lot of people.
If the World Championships, I don't know about the World Cup. I think you would at least get 7,000 to 8,000 for the World Cup if you package it right. At least I would like to think you could sell it out. I think if the World Championships comes to Iowa City, no doubt that sells out.
Absolutely.
There's zero doubt. You have only upside for the attendance. Now, I don't know about, like we said, all of the things that go into it. The nice thing about Vegas is that if you want to stay, you have a hotel connected to the venue. You experience that where you wake up in the morning and you get to walk right there.
We loved it.
Yeah. You would not have that at Carver Hawkeye Arena in Iowa City. It's going to be a logistical nightmare regardless, because regardless of where you stay, even if you have to stay in Cedar Rapids.
System, though.
Well, but I know, but how do you compare bus system to waking up and walking, especially for a guy like you that loves the convenience of it all?
Yeah,
I think that you would struggle with that component. And even if you say, well, it's sold out in Iowa City, just go to Cedar Rapids, that's still 20, 30-minute drive, and then you got to find parking, and how do you get in, and access points. That's going to be the hardest part, even if it sells out.
They're talking shuttle buses from Cedar Rapids to Iowa City, so, everything's possible if you just put the effort into it.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think the World Cup is a good first step to see how it goes.
Good point.
Yeah, get a major international tournament and see how things materialize, and then go from there. But I'm very excited about that opportunity to have that in the state of Iowa. It continues to grow our status, because you've seen this kind of evolve over the course of our time following wrestling, which has been over 20 years now, is that you've seen some great tournaments come through, and then you have an opportunity to have some big world stage after the NCAA tournament.
I wanted to point out that a couple of weeks ago we had on the new West Waterloo coach. And now Will Kelly up at Cedar Falls is going to be going to have to be replaced. So
correct. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
See how that's going to go.
Yeah, he went to Dubuque.
Back to his home.
Yeah, back to his home.
You can't fault anyone for that.
Yeah, and I liked Will. I liked what he was doing. I think he had a good vision. I liked what he did with Cedar Valley Mat Club. So Will Kelly will be missed as the Cedar Falls head wrestling coach. I don't know if Brad Penrith is going to come in as the interim coach. He was helping there as an assistant. If he's going to
kind of what I wondered.
Take on for a year. So we'll see how all that materializes. I'm stoked for our guest today. We have to take a break, but Joe Gibbons, a 4-time state champion who went on to be an NCAA champion at Iowa State University, will be on the program next. 1650 The Fan.
1650 The Fan, KCNZ.
We are back on the mat, 1650 The Fan. I am Kyle Klingman of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame Dan Gable Museum, along with Doug Van Gelder. And Doug said it best. We have a special guest on the program for 2 segments. Joe Gibbons was a 4-time state wrestling champion for 2 schools, went to Waterloo Columbus for his first 2 years, and then went to Ames High School for his last 2, was our 4-time state champion in the state of Iowa, parlayed that into great success at Iowa State University, 4-time All-American, placed 4th or better at the NCAA tournament all 4 years, won an NCAA championship at 142 pounds in 1985. He's on with us. How are you, Joe?
Good morning. Yeah, doing well.
Hey, good to talk to you. And as we mentioned, you went to Iowa State and you went to Columbus. North Dakota State beats Iowa in football. Chris Kleiman, the head football coach, went to Waterloo Columbus. Is there a sense of satisfaction that you had a Waterloo Columbus guy beat Iowa?
That's correct. I went to school with his brother Scott, who was our quarterback at Waterloo Columbus, and so I had a good friendship with him during my 2 years there, and glad to see him having success and his brother having success at North Dakota State. But sorry for that being at the expense of the Hawkeyes.
Iowa versus Iowa State is a huge rivalry in wrestling, and when we put it in perspective, it's a special time to be able to have a great rivalry, especially in the 1980s when you were competing. When someone says, hey, Iowa versus Iowa State in wrestling, what do you think about?
Well, just great matchups, and before I got there and competed, I watched a lot of those great teams of the 70s wrestle each other, and one of the big questions was, because Gable was doing great things at Iowa, they go, gosh, do you ever wish you would have wrestled for him? And I said, yeah, but I knew Gable when he was a Cyclone. And so my dad took us to those matches back in the, late 60s, early 70s when we were just little guys, before they had Hilton Coliseum. And so we got our firsthand experience of those wrestling matches early on. And so we got a taste of it as a fan, and then we got into college and we knew how important it was, and so you wanted to beat your crosstown rival, which was actually the best team in the country.
When I think of Joe Gibbons, I think of you as part of the Gibbons family. It's such an important family to the state of Iowa and to wrestling because of all you accomplished. You were the third of four. It was Tim, Jim, and then you had your brother Jeff. How do you think that affected you, the order that you came along in your wrestling career?
I think it was definitely to my advantage. Being the third kid, now it was tough growing up, and I didn't see it while it was happening. I tailgated my two older brothers. They kind of, made a path, got involved in wrestling, at like 6th and 7th grade. And then shortly thereafter, I was their workout partner, a drilling partner. And, you go to the first tournament, you're seeing kids your size wrestle there. And so I got exposed to it a lot quicker than they did. And, of course, if you can see brothers competing and having success, then you just follow suit. So I looked up to my two older brothers, Jim and Tim, and it helped me have the success that I did have.
Did they take it out on you in these workout rooms? I'm assuming you guys wrestled. Did they want to beat up little brother?
Oh, well, you know what? My brother Jim and Tim were similar size, and they were 1 year apart in school. So on any given night, and my dad was notorious for having us compete against each other, especially the two older ones, Jim and Tim. And on any given night, one would beat the other. So, Jim might be upset, crying, and next night Tim would be upset, And so, me being a younger brother, well, if you wanted to win 100% of your matches, all you had to do is look down the pecking order, and it was me. And my memories were I got beat up a lot when I was little, and there was a lot of crying in my world. And then I had a younger brother, Jeff, and I thought, well, heck, I'll just go beat up on Jeff. And all I found out when I beat up on Jeff was how tough my mom was, because you don't beat up on the baby in the family. So there for several years, I never won a match in our house.
What was your dad like? What kind of personality did he bring to your family?
My dad's one of those guys. It's kind of like John Kerber, the father of Jeff Kerber. Really intelligent, kind of thought outside the box. I mean, he grew up in Waterloo. We were born in Waterloo. My brothers Jim, Tim, and I, and younger brother Jeff was born in Iowa City, but he grew up in Waterloo. He went to East Waterloo, and there was a lot of great wrestling in Waterloo. That was the epicenter of especially high school wrestling. East and West Waterloo were trading off on who were going to win the state championships. My dad never wrestled. He's kind of a car guy, and eventually went on to Iowa City and became an attorney. But he introduced us because he looked at us and he says, as we grew up, we were just like anybody. We loved football, baseball, and basketball. But he said, look at your parents. My dad was 5'6.5". My mom was 5'4.5". We're not big people. And so he got us introduced at a young age, but he grew up in a community where wrestling was important. And also, my mom is from Cresco, Iowa, where Coach, Gary Kurtemeyer and legendary coach Harold Nichols are from. And I had uncles that wrestled at Iowa State. So there was just a lot of things pointing towards wrestling would probably be the best sport for us to achieve success.
On the line with Joe Gibbons, 4-time state wrestling champion and NCAA champion for Iowa State. When you're a four-time state champion, of course, the first year is the most important because you have to win it as a freshman to be able to set yourself up for the remaining 3 years. Your freshman year was interesting because you had a guy named Tim Schultz in your weight class from Charles City, and interestingly, Jim Miller happened to be coaching Tim Schultz at the time. You lost to Tim Schultz in your first meeting against him early in the season, but you were able to get retribution in the state wrestling finals. Take us through that journey on what Tim Schultz and that roadblock was for you at the state wrestling tournament when you were a freshman.
Well, to start things out, I grew up on those kid tournaments, and we met the Kerber family from Emmitsburg. So we started hanging out with them, which was, birds of a feather flock together, and they wanted to be good at wrestling. So Jeff Kerber was 2 years older than me, and he was he was undefeated, won 2 state titles, and he was on his way to having an undefeated career, 4-time state champion. So I kind of looked at Jeff going, man, I want to be like Jeff Kerber, a 4-time state champ. Of course, my brother Jim had just finished his career, and he was a 3-time state champ. So I set that goal to become a 4-time state champion in 6th grade. And then we moved back to Waterloo, where my grandparents and relatives lived, built a house out in the country, and went to Waterloo, Columbus to wrestle as a freshman. And I wrestled for Dennis Getz, who was a great high school coach, taught me a lot. We had an experienced seasoned team. We had a team that probably could have won the state title in 1978. And I just remember a young guy and, going through everything for the first time, that first morning weigh-in, getting on that Bluebird bus, heading to Charles City and going up against Charles City. I had no idea who I was wrestling that night, which is kind of different now with social media. You know everything about your opponent. And I went up there, and I was on a senior dominant team. Like I said, we were good, and just getting up there and wrestling. And I remember that night where the lights were, they had a spotlight over the mat, and going out there and shaking hands and wrestling that match against Tim Schultz. I didn't realize that he had gotten second the year before. He was theoretically the number 1 ranked kid in the state, but I was just out there wrestling, which was probably good that I didn't have to overthink it. And it was just a heck of a battle. I remember getting in on a fireman's carry and almost taking him down, and then he hip scissored out of it, and I lost the match 6-5. Now here I am, the first match of my career. I'm 0-1, and I had no idea I was wrestling the number 1 kid in the state. And it was one of those few times where my parents were out of town, didn't get to see me wrestle. Probably the only time. And there you are. You're almost afraid to look at your parents in the eye because you're already 0-1, but you didn't realize you just wrestled the number 1 kid in the state. And so I went to work, and I had a great workout room, great coach, Dennis Getz, Gary Long, and the season progressed, and won basically all my matches until I got to the districts in Waterloo, which is a tough district, and Charles City was in it. And I wrestled Tim Schultz again in the finals. And he beat me, I believe, like 4-1. He rode me, he took me down, he dominated me in that match. And I'm just going, holy cow. One side of the coin, I was happy to make it to state, because you're wrestling in a tough district. And the other side of the coin, gosh, how am I going to beat this guy? Because we're going to wrestle a week later. But what was nice about it is we got cross-bracketed. You wrestle in the districts together, and you get first and second. They put you on opposite sides of the bracket. And I was really good, and Coach Getz coached us to wrestle each match, 1 match at a time in your tournament. And I got into the finals, and again, I got to wrestle Tim Schultz again. And I remember running into my dad down on the main floor in Veterans Auditorium, the old barn. And my dad, this is what he said to me. He goes, there ain't a person in here tonight that thinks you're going to win, but I sure do think you're going to win. So that kind of got me focused. You're right. My dad believes I can win. And so then I'm hanging out before the Grand Marshal, takes us out, the Champions Walk. And I'm sitting next to Jeff Kerber, and I'm sitting next to Jim Lord. Both those wrestlers, Lord was going for his 3rd state title, so was Jeff Kerber. And I was just kind of nervous that night. And Jim Lord's asking me, hey, how are you going to beat this guy? And Jeff Kerber just kind of piped up, and he said, look, all you got to do is go out there and score more points. Because when I thought about the match against Tim Schultz, he dominated me at the districts. I didn't know how I was going to beat him. But when you just go out there, wrestle hard, try to score more points, it kind of simplified it, and it got me to relax. And then I realized, the pressure was on Tim Schultz because I had nothing to lose. So I went out there and wrestled that match, and it actually was my best match of the tournament. I got my fireman's carry early in the match, and then I got my escape, and then I was able to ride him hard and win the match 3-1. I let him go with like 10 seconds left just to not, get caught in a move or something. But it sure was an exciting night, and it kind of just kicked things off for me to achieve my goals.
You were standing in a hotel with Jim Miller having a conversation. Do you remember who showed up out of the blue?
Well, you're talking about at the National Wrestling Tournament?
Yeah.
Yeah, this happened, was it 2 years ago? Yeah, I was talking to Jim Miller out in the concourse, and all of a sudden a guy shows up, and he's coming from my backside, so I don't see him. And he looks at Coach Miller, and he goes, "You don't recognize who I am," And he stared, and it took him a while. And then all of a sudden, Tim Schultz. It was Tim Schultz, just popped out of the blue. I mean, he hadn't seen Tim Schultz in years. I haven't seen him since high school, since that summer when Tim Schultz went on to win the National Federation title as a senior, and we were in two different weight classes. I got third. He got first at 98. I got third at 105. I hadn't seen him since then. And holy cow, it was great to see him. I mean, he's a part of my memories. I know it hurt him to lose that match, but he made me a lot better. And that summer he ends up winning the national title. So theoretically, in order for me to win a state title, I had to beat the best wrestler in the country, who was Tim Schultz. He won that national title. So, happy for him in that effort.
But doesn't that really kind of say something about the connectedness of the sport, that here you are talking to Jim Miller, his coach in high school, and then he happens to pop out? It just seems like that happens in wrestling more than any other sport.
Yeah, I look back, and I had a lot of coaches in my life, and and Jim Miller, I mean, I looked up to him tremendously, and East Waterloo boy like my dad, and I followed his whole career. I remember him wrestling in college when he was at UNI and placing in the Division I Nationals, being a finalist and just being one tough wrestler. My dad knew a lot about him and told us about him. But, you're right, it is a small community. And then, and you look back at Jim's career, all the success he had after he left Charles City, but it all kind of started at Charles City. Matter of fact, I think he was an assistant coach at Riceville before he went to Charles City. And look what he did, how much of an impact he had on everybody, not just the people that he directly coached, but guys like me and my brothers and everybody else in the state of Iowa. That's what's great about our sport is just the relationships. Because when I look back, it's not all, the accomplishments, the titles or winning a national championship. It was really all these friendships I had. Just the other day I talked to Jim Ward from Lisbon, who lives down in Dallas, Texas. I talk to Jeff Kerber periodically. I see Scott Morningstar, and there's Greg Randall, out west and doing his thing, and we all stay connected. Whenever we run into each other, it's like time just, it didn't move on. It was just, you still had those connections.
You were the fourth four-time state champion in Iowa high school history, and then you went to Iowa State. Was there inherent pressure to win an NCAA championship? Because this was a pretty new thing for the state of Iowa. Bob Steenledge won it in the early 60s, but then it really had this flow of some great wrestlers come through. Did you have a little bit of expectation going into Iowa State?
Absolutely, because when you're around, it's just like the next goal. When I set a goal and I accomplished it or I didn't accomplish it, you're always setting the next goal. But to get to college, especially if you're going to go to a place like Iowa State, it's about winning national championships and Big 8 championships and having great team success. So, yeah, there was a lot of pressure, and I kind of felt like, being one of the top recruits in the country and being recruited by everybody, Gable at Iowa and Abel at Oklahoma and Oklahoma State and Wisconsin with Dwayne Clevin. I had that expectation, there was a lot of pressure. It's just not can you win a national title, but how many can you win? And then when you go through it, you realize, boy, you've got to be healthy. There's a lot of things that got to work in your favor. You may be the best guy in the weight class, but you may not win that tournament on that weekend. So you can't take anything for granted. So as a freshman, I wrestled as a true freshman. I wrestled right away, and you're not guaranteed to get back there. A lot of things can happen. And matter of fact, if you go through a redshirt year and 5 years of wrestling, your body takes a beating. And sometimes you're in better position early on in your career than you are later on in your career. And that's what people need to understand. You need to seize the moment every time you step on the mat and every year that you're wrestling early on, that you may not get back there.
On the line with Joe Gibbons, NCAA champion for Iowa State in 1985, and we just have a minute here before we have to take a break. You redshirted after your true freshman year. Why'd you make that decision?
Well, you know what? When I came in right away, I wrestled 32 as a senior in high school, and I wrestled 43 that summer in the state freestyles, and and 32 at the nationals. I was big, and I came in there. My brother Jim was a fifth-year senior. We had a really good returning team. We had guys like Terry Hummel, Mike Mann, Wayne Cole from Fort Dodge, Nate Carr, Kevin Darkus, Randy Conrad. So we had a team that could threaten for the national title. And so there was two things there, be on the national championship team and then wrestle with your brother Jim, because there was only 1 year that I could do it. So I made the sacrifice and cut down to 26. I really would have wrestled 34 that year, but you got the defending national champion, who happens to be your brother, at your weight class. So I made a sacrifice and cut down. And then after going through that year of the extreme weight cutting, that the next year I just wasn't physically ready and probably mentally ready, because cutting back down to 34 the following year was just as hard as cutting to 26 the year before. So I got in the weight room, took a little bit of a break, and then redshirted so I could go 42 the following year.
All right, we have to take our first break with Joe Gibbons. More with Joe Gibbons next on the mat, 1650 The Fan.
1650 The Fan, KCNZ.
We are back on the mat, 1650 The Fan. I am Kyle Klingman of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame Dan Gable Museum, along with Doug Van Gelder, and another segment with Joe Gibbons. You were talking about wrestling as a true freshman with your brother Jim, and I want to go into that dynamic with your brother Jim because you wrestled on the same team together in 1982. You were at 126. He was at 134, and then as it turns out that he was the head wrestling coach for you in your senior year in 1986. I don't know how often that would happen for someone. I can't think of anyone that has ever happened to, but let's go back to that 1982 year. Of course, when you're 126, he's 134, the natural inclination is to think, hey, those guys are going to be workout partners. Did you guys wrestle a lot in practice at being those close weight classes?
Yeah, we wrestled a lot. I mean, Jim was a great mentor to me. Matter of fact, he had just won the national title the year before. So, he was great workout partners. I mean, when you look at Coach Nichols' restroom, that's what it had. It had great workout partners. So no matter whatever corner of the room I went to, I was gonna have a great workout partner. So, and another thing is that Jim and I would often come in, like in between classes in the morning and drill. We had Chris Campbell there helping us out, the great, two-time national champ, world champ from Iowa. He was an assistant coach there, and he did a tremendous amount for Jim and I to really dial us in on technique and discipline of the sport. So, it was a great year when I look back wrestling with my older brother and the great coaching that surrounded us.
I don't see you guys as being a brand style type of interaction where you guys throw punches. What was it like wrestling your brother in that environment?
You're right. My brother Jim was more of a technician, well-conditioned. When you cut weight like we did, you had to get in shape first. So it was a different style. And, Jim was more, like I said, he could go hard and in a condition standpoint, but he had great technique. I was a little more physical, and so, I like to stay in a position, use my strength, use my hip, and just physically wear on someone, but no, I don't think we could be considered wrestling like brands or having those type of practices like Terry and Tom would have. I mean, we had battles, but I don't think it ever came to punches.
He was known for his high crotch takedown. Did you learn how to defend it after having him hit it on you so many times?
The best thing is just don't let him in on your legs. So that taught me how to stay low in my stance. Because if you stood up, he was going to get in on you. Yeah. If he got in on you, he was probably going to take you down.
So go to the end of your career, 1986 is your senior season. Now he's the head wrestling coach of Iowa State at the age of 26. What was that like, having your brother be the head wrestling coach when you had him as a teammate when you were a freshman?
Well, so when he was done, the story is he was going to go down in Texas. My dad had a farm down in Texas, and Jim had a farm operations degree, and he was going to get out of the sport, but Nick kept him around as an assistant coach. So he was an assistant coach for those 2 years, and then we were at the Virginia Duels the year that I won the national title, and Les Anderson and my brother Jim called us into the room and said, hey, later today, back in Ames, Coach Nichols is going to announce his retirement at the end of the year, effective the end of the year. So they're just kind of, that was crazy because Coach Nichols had been there for over 30-some years. We didn't know who the next coach was going to be. And so it was kind of surprising how it happened because Max Urig and Dave Cox, the athletic director and assistant athletic director, asked Jim to apply for the job. And then next thing you know, Jim gets the job, and he makes the announcement that Ed Bannick's coming in. And there was a lot of excitement around our team. And so, I was used to him. It was no surprise. It was something, that I'd been around, and a lot of the other wrestlers had been around. So it was a nice transition, to be honest with you.
1984, your sophomore season, you mentioned Jeff Kerber as being one of your heroes and someone that you patterned your career after and someone that you aspired to be. He was in the same weight class as you at 142 pounds. What's that like, knowing that you guys were friends, he brought you up, and now you're competitors?
Well, it involves a lot of adrenaline, and, the Kerbers were Iowa State fans early on, then he got caught in transition, and then Gable's at Iowa doing great things, so he ends up going to Iowa. It was tough wrestling Jeff. Matter of fact, I only wrestled him once, and that was in the Ncaa tournament. We wrestled there. At the dual meets, I think I ended up wrestling Kevin Dresser a time or two and some of these other guys. And so I only wrestled Jeff actually once, and it was the last tournament of his career. So, but it was tough, and he's a great friend. He helped me a lot in my development, and so that's how it ended.
On the line with Joe Gibbons, 4-time state wrestling champion, won 2 at Waterloo Columbus, 2 at Ames, then went on to win an NCAA tournament in 1985 for Iowa State. You were the last NCAA champion for legendary coach Harold Nichols. I think that would have to be a special credential for you, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of great memories that night in Oklahoma and wrestling for Coach. All the champions that he had. It's glad I was one of them. I miss him. I miss him a lot today, and what he did for my family and the sport of wrestling.
Your junior year, when you won it, you wrestled 53 matches, still the most of any Iowa State Cyclone to wrestle 53. That's almost unheard of anymore. And then the next year, you wrestle 26 matches. Why did that get cut in half over the course of that time?
Well, what happened was early in the season, I was wrestling a Nebraska kid, and I got a high ankle sprain and had no idea what it was until you actually do it. You felt like you broke your foot. As a matter of fact, you wish you would have. And so that kept me out the first half of the season. And then the second half of the season, I wore a stirrup, and they just kind of taped my foot. So I was kind of like Jack Dempsey out there wrestling. I couldn't move my ankle. But, like I said, I was a fifth-year senior, and sometimes things don't go your way. Being healthy is a huge part of it. And, and so that kind of limited the matches that I wrestled in, and I missed a lot. And we had a good young team there because that was kind of the nucleus of what would happen the following year as we won the national title.
Were you worn out by the end of your career at Iowa State? You had mentioned that, hey, when you're a freshman, you can come out and just really come out and explode onto the scene. What was it like being in your fifth year, injured, and then finally have to end it that way? You placed third, but were you a little bit worn out by the end of your career?
You're more mentally, you just, because there's a lot of pressure when you come in there and you want to win multiple national titles, and I ain't the only one that's gone through. There's a lot of guys that never won that tournament that deserved to win that tournament, at a lot of different universities. And I came in there, you're a freshman, and that's what's good about coming to places like Iowa State and Iowa. You could be a great high school wrestler, a top recruit, but you got guys like Jim Gibbons, Nate Carr, Mike Mann. I had a lot of other guys that were better than me, and so I just learned by example. And then all of a sudden, you get to the end of your career, people are looking up to you, and you want to live up to those expectations as a captain, as a leader, as a defending national champion, and sometimes your health can get in the way. And that kind of happened a little bit, but that's just part of the sport.
On the line with Joe Gibbons, 4-time state wrestling champion in Iowa, NCAA champion for Iowa State, and then you went on and coached underneath your brother as an assistant coach. Jim had a good career as a head wrestling coach, albeit short, 96 and 32 record, won an NCAA tournament in 1987, the last NCAA tournament that Iowa State has won in wrestling. But in 1992, when he decided to resign, you were the guy that was supposed to be the next coach. It ended up being Bobby Douglas. What happened there that you didn't end up being the head wrestling coach at Iowa State?
Well, you know what? There's a lot of things. I mean, you know, when it happened quick, I probably found out a couple weeks before everybody else that Jim was no longer going to be coaching, that he was going to step away and do something else. And I was excited because I love recruiting. I loved, being an ambassador for Iowa State University. It's the, program that I grew up around, and I wanted to see us win national titles. And I saw it happen before I got there, saw it happen while I was there. And so that's exciting, and I went out and started recruiting once Jim got out there. I thought I had a really good class, with the class that we had returning, that this would be a great opportunity. But it just didn't work in my favor, and they went with a great coach, Bobby Douglas, and again, I wasn't able to fulfill it. And so when that happened, I just took my master's degree and my 2 degrees at Iowa State, went out in the business world, and here we are today.
And it's interesting because it feels like we, as a sport, lost a great coach. Do you have thoughts that, hey, I could have done this. I could have been a great head wrestling coach. Do you ever think back about that and wish you would have gone that route?
Well, you know what? There's no doubt. I think I could have did a great job, because when you're passionate about something, I mean, it takes a lot of positive energy. And, I saw a lot of great coaches ahead of me. Coach Harold Nichols, Les Anderson, Chris Campbell, Willie Gatson, my brother Jim, and then I was around guys like, Jim Miller, Dan Gable, you saw these, and you just take little bits. Well, what would I do if I was the guy? And you're always thinking about that. It's just a natural thing. And there's no doubt, that I think I could have had a lot of great success up there. And you look back, and that's probably the one thing, gosh, I wish I would have had my shot. But now that I look back, I sure do like going to the state tournaments, the national tournaments, seeing all my old friends again. Life's moved on. I got a 9-year-old son that, believe it or not, loves wrestling. He loves football, loves all sports, but he's really picking up on it. And so I get to get back into the sport by, taking him to camps and things like that and seeing old friends.
Well, you mentioned that you have a business. You own Culver's Restaurants. From a business point of view, what should wrestling be doing different to market our product?
Well, just like you said a little bit ago, do you wish you would have coached? I go, yeah. And the problem, or the sad thing about our sport is, and I talked to Jay Robinson about this, look at his situation, coached 30 years, and now he's being forced out. We've talked about it, and he told us that our greatest people, not all of them, but a lot of them, end up leaving the sport too early, because there's a lack of opportunities. And I understand that. I mean, back in the 70s, there might have been 170 to 200 teams that could qualify for the Division I Nationals. Now I think it's below 80. So there's not a lot of opportunities out there for our sport, our great sport that we have, which prepares you for life like no other. And so that's sad to witness that. And I realized that even, 25 years ago, that the opportunities were limited. If I didn't get Iowa State, then there probably wasn't a lot of great opportunities. And so I decided to step out. And like Coach Robinson said, we see a lot of our people leave because of those opportunities.
On the line with Joe Gibbons, 4-time state wrestling champion in Iowa, NCAA champion for Iowa State in 1985. We did this with Dan Gable. I want to resurrect this and ask all of our guests this, so you're our second trial run on this. Wrestling Mount Rushmore. Who would be on Joe Gibbons' Wrestling Mount Rushmore? Of course, I think you know what Mount Rushmore is, that you have 4 opportunities to have someone on that. Who would you pick, Joe?
Holy cow, I should have thought about this, but
But that's no fun. I want you to think about this. I want you to be on the spot.
You talk about the Mount Rushmore for the national scene. Are you talking about for the state of Iowa?
It can be however you want to define it. The 4 people in wrestling that you think deserve to be on the Mount Rushmore of our sport.
Well, there's no doubt we got to put Dan Gable there. That's an easy one. With all he's accomplished as a wrestler and a coach. I think you got John Smith. When you run off 6 World Olympic Championships in a row and had the success he had coming from the great family and the great historical program, there's no doubt that, John Smith belongs on there. And he proved just how tough that is because, look at Jordan Burroughs, one of the greatest talents we've seen in our sport. It's tough to do, run off 6 in a row. So, and then Cale Sanderson, another great Iowa Stater with what he did, undefeated career, Olympic champ. So I put him on there. I'm writing this down, and I'm thinking about who that 4th person would be.
It's always the toughest, that 4th one.
Yeah. Am I similar to what you would do?
Yeah, pretty. At least John Smith and Dan Gable for sure. I'd have to think about Cale. I would probably go maybe a little bit more international, but hey, this is your list.
Well, yeah, I'm kind of being a proud American right now, so I'm not going to go international.
Well, international within the United States. I think it has to all be U.S. wrestlers if it's Mount Rushmore.
There you go.
Well, it is your list, but I'm just saying my preference. And we got 40 seconds here, so before we have to close out. So we're putting you on the hot seat here.
You put me on the hot seat here. Help me out here. Yeah.
He's going to time us out.
Yeah, you're going to time us out. So 3 out of 4.
Warning.
Yeah. We got to close out, but hey, we appreciate you coming on the program. If you think of one, you can let me know, and we'll put it on the show for next week.
Sounds great.
All right, hey, we enjoyed having Joe Gibbons on the program. For Joe Gibbons and Doug Van Gelder, I'm Kyle Klingman. You've been listening to On the Mat on 1650 The Fan.
You've been listening to On the Mat, a presentation of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame Dan Gable Museum, and brought to you by Rolling Ford in Shell Rock on 1650 The Fan, KCNZ.
This show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MattTalkOnline.com.